Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It is good to be with you this morning. Of course, take a moment, like the video, take a minute, share it on social media, invite some more people into this conversation, let them know that we've started. And yeah, of course, support us on Patreon if you don't already. We do have a new study group coming up and lots of good things. So, um, this conversation today, we're going to be talking about a book that is coming out soon. I think a little later this summer, maybe early fall. We can clarify that, but it's from our friends at Iskra Books. It is called Building a People's Art. And I will let our guests talk a little bit about the figures that it translates these writings of Vietnamese revolutionary cultural theorists thinking with communist theory around art, around revolution. Um, and it's very interesting work. The intro itself is really great, which our guest today wrote. Um, and we'll talk a little bit about the process of translation and a number of different questions. Folks who are interested, I think this would be a great conversation for people who are um, for all kinds of people, but especially if you're a creative or a cultural worker or whatever, and you want to make revolutionary art. I think it's a really interesting book to read, to look at the ways that revolutionaries have thought about this in the past, the debates that they've had, the positions that they've taken, the kinds of um, cultural fronts that they've made. And I think we'll get into it a little bit, but I think it's interesting also to think about in the context of resistance to Zionism and to genocide and the Palestinian liberation struggle. So anyway, I hope folks get a lot out of it, and I certainly enjoyed reading the book. And there's a link in the show description to Iskra Books, which you can go on. They have a number of other things out right now, including the historical documents of the PLO is one of their recent books that they've published. One behind my shoulder here, um, Stalin, what is it? Critique of a Black Legend, something along those lines by Lacerdo, and which we had a conversation on the pod about last year. And there's actually a part two, which I have to apologize to Henry if he's listening. Shout out to Henry Hakamaki. That will come out by August at the latest. And so check out for that on the audio podcast side. So before we go further, our guest today is Ruehl Muller. He's currently a senior lecturer, associate professor at the Institute of Creativity and Innovation in, I hope I don't mispronounce this, but Xiamen University in China. He is from South Africa. And we're also going to take a moment, obviously, is a fairly significant event for Vietnam within the last week, I think, certainly within the last 2 weeks. But there was the passing of General Secretary um, Wen Fu Chong. And I'm going to let Rule say a few words about him and about that passing, which is very significant for the people of Vietnam. And obviously, we, send our condolences, our sympathies to them as a nation as you know, as they grapple with this. So, Rule, welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. It's good to be with you. Yeah, do you want to start just saying a few words on that? The event of the passing there.
Oh yeah, well, thank you first of all for having me. It's really cool to be quite nerve-wracking being live, but other than that, very cool. Um, yeah, unfortunate timing, I guess, with this talking about Vietnam and then this the current situation. Um, I think the thing that is quite interesting. I was speaking to a friend from Israel actually, just before this about how for it, for most people, it seems that the the history, especially the politics of Vietnam, almost ended in 1975. Beyond that, even Western leftists, they will know Ho Chi Minh, they will know perhaps General Zap, and then who else? But like Nguyen Phu Trong is perhaps one of the most influential general secretaries that Vietnam has had since Ho Chi Minh. So it really is quite a significant event for the country. And it would be wrong for us to do this podcast without at least putting that forward. In case anyone's interested, I'll try to be brief because I know we've got art and stuff to talk about. But he was one of the figures, basically, that was associated with this modern renovation period and increasing the economic output of Vietnam. But in the later years, what he was doing towards the end is a massive campaign of eliminating corruption, which is probably the biggest problem that Vietnam has at this stage. And I think in that regard, he's been really one of the leading historical figures for Vietnam, which is bizarre because we know Ho Chi Minh, but most of us don't know Nguyen Phu Trong, who is almost on par, on that level of influence and actual structural benefit. So yeah, it's sad time, but things are moving at least.
Absolutely. And I think that point that you made is absolutely correct, in terms of the even among, leftists who might be sympathetic, who are interested in projects of building socialism and so on. There is very little. I mean, I don't have a great deal of knowledge at all, and the books behind my shoulder are by the two people that you referenced, that we might know a little bit about, and so that's one of the things. Also, I'd say that I'm happy to have this conversation with you today, and really enjoyed reading the book because there is this. I mean, Vijay Prashad has also talked about how people don't really understand Ho Chi Minh either. That they don't actually really consider him an important thinker, an important theorist, and so there's also this way in which, people think about the struggle in Vietnam as maybe a national liberation struggle that, is about national independence and so on, but don't actually grapple with the communist socialist content and theory that is produced out of it. And so this book, I think, is an intervention in that way of, saying, hey, these people are really important theorists, and here are some of the things that they were writing about and thinking about. And so I applaud you and Iskra for that work of bringing this into English. Now, did you do the translation?
So yes, I did the translation, but I mean, it would be completely unfair for me to say like I did it unaided. There were so many people that helped. Vulandan, my Chowling, where lots of people were like responsible for contributing. I mean, the the Vietnamese language is first off, it's quite difficult, but it's also very proverbial, I guess. Like especially in from that time period, there were a lot of proverbs used, or idioms are perhaps better. And is translating it is one thing, but trying to translate the idioms is a whole another thing. So I'm quite confident with my Vietnamese, and I went in a little bit arrogantly in that regard, thinking, I know what this word is, I know what this word is, I know what this word is, and then I got hit with the idioms. So it was by no means just me. There were a lot of people responsible for helping out with this translation.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that work, and to all of your colleagues that helped you put it together. So let's just say a little bit upfront about why for you this is an important book. You talk a bit about this in the preparer's note in terms of your intended audience for the book, and some of the decisions you had to make about putting it together. I think that's a great way for us to kind of move into discussing the book. So why don't we start there?
I think, like we actually just mentioned, and with the the Ho Chi Minh general stuff, and then that's it kind of trajectory. I think there is a significant lack of information, especially in English, about just Vietnamese theorists in general. I don't think that's the fault of anyone. I think it's just got to do with lack of translation, which is what hopefully books like this can add to and encourage and get the ball rolling, so to say. Um, I there is a small sense of elitism, I guess you could call it that, in in regards to really who holds the power of being able to translate these books. So, like you said, you raised a very good point when you said that most people don't really even understand Ho Chi Minh, and one of the reasons is because Ho Chi Minh wrote and said a lot, loads. There's volumes and volumes and volumes, and even his translations into English have been very selective by people. And I think that is an issue that we need to kind of resolve, where these figures need to be looked at in their totality, rather than just, the bits that suit this idea or this idea or this idea. And I mean, the only way to really do that is to, especially with something as, you know, intersectional as Ho Chi Minh thought, which touches on a whole range of stuff, is to kind of bring these other elements into it, like aesthetics, like art, like literature, things that aren't necessarily straightforward about the war. Obviously the war is always burning underneath. It's always a simmering subject. Colonialism, the history of Vietnam, it's always there. But there are other mediums basically that can help inform, help add to this totality to prevent this very selective translating that we see. So that was one of the reasons. Ching, who is probably the leading figure in this text, was also a general secretary, just like Ho Chi Minh, just like Nguyen Phu Trong. In fact, he was a general secretary twice. And then the other figure is To Hugh, who was a poet, but who also dabbled in politics and really cemented himself as a figure in that regard. But I think that what you mentioned about the difficulties in putting the book together was, I felt it was important to introduce these theories, but the problem when you deal with art is that there's a wonderful quote by John Berger. I think I put it in the book, that I think he says that seeing establishes our place in the surrounding world. And we explain the world using words, but the words can't undo the fact that we are surrounded by it, by everything. And it's this idea that things have to be seen, especially if we're talking about aesthetics. So while I wanted to translate the text and present these texts as, artifacts of their own, it would be, for me at least, almost completely pointless if I didn't try show the art itself, the art that resulted from these texts, the art that these texts gave rise to. And that in itself was a very difficult situation, because on the one hand, the intended audience from the beginning have always really been organizers, I would say, for lack of a better word. I mean, it's not a coffee table book. It has the aesthetic of a coffee table book with the art and the decorative pictures and that kind of thing. But it's not that. It's a book intended for organizers. But how do you, to create something for organizers, you have to be, cognizant of the cost, of the ease in it, and that kind of thing. So how do you do justice to these artworks while keeping the book affordable and you know in the hands of the people that deserve to have it. Um, and there was a really big, you know, tension, I would suppose, in that regard of what to do. And I think that's why. So originally, I I won't say the name, but there was another publisher that I was planning to work with, and this tension is what drew me to Iskra, and thank God for that because now I have a wonderful relationship with them. But with the understanding that we then have the opportunity to also release this book for free, so that yes, I understand that it's a book for organizers, and hypocritically, it probably will be quite expensive because it's got full color artworks throughout, literally 100 of them. But at the same time, it will be released for free for those who can't afford and who need it. Um, so that was one of the things that drew me to it. Just on that note, I would be really really evil if I didn't give a shout out to Adrian Jones and Witness Collection. They're an organization that helped me basically collate these artworks. And I mean, they scanned, they collected, they archived, they scanned, I think almost 1,000 pieces. And from that 1,000 pieces, we brought it down to 500. And then from that 500, we narrowed it down to 100 to get them in this book. And almost all the works in the book are printed for the first time, which I mean, again, is absolutely bizarre because when you look at how the Soviet and Chinese socialist realist works have survived, it's bizarre that the Vietnamese works have survived, but are not as influential or readily available as these works. I mean, if you have to look at any form of socialist realist art from Vietnam now, you're just going to get the propaganda posters, but not the actual artworks themselves. These have all seemed to be just been neglected. So that was another reason to try and bring these neglected images back into the hands of people who could really benefit in seeing them.
I appreciate that. And I'm going to, throughout this conversation, I will share some of these beautiful pieces of art because I was saying to you before we started that, like, I mean, I think if people, there's like a lot of different things that people could get from this book. Like you say, there's a, and we'll talk about more of this, I'm sure, as we get into the discussion of the cultural theory, but like there's definitely this use for organizers and for organizations, in thinking about the role of art and of aesthetics of culture. Um, but there's also, I mean, just if you were an appreciator of art, like you say, there's 100 beautiful pictures,
Yeah.
through the book for people to look at. And yeah, so
Oh,
there's just sort
sorry
of
to
multiple levels.
interrupt.
Yeah.
If I could just quickly interrupt. On that note, the 100 pictures in the book as well is there was a whole nother internal tension with that, where I really did not want to do the very academic elitist thing of then speaking about these artworks and and doing a whole compare and contrast and talking about the techniques and all that. So you will see in the book, I very rarely, unless using it to illustrate some contextual point, actually mention the artworks in it, and that was mainly to prevent this thing of someone from the outside coming in and giving my opinion on the arts. My opinion on the artworks does not matter. So the
Mhm.
art are really there to speak for themselves. So when you look at the book, you will see the texts from Ching and the texts from Tohu, and then you will see the art from these artists. And let it speak for itself. I don't give anything on it because I don't think it would be fair. It would be right to do that.
Yeah, I appreciate that too. All right, so let's move into this discussion a little bit. So, um, in the introduction, the introduction is beautifully written, by the way. I just want to compliment you on that. You offer a bit of background on these figures that are doing, just to clarify for the audience, this book is a translation of selected works by two figures, primarily, right? And so those figures are Chinh and Tohu, as you mentioned a little bit earlier. So can you say a little bit about them and who they were and some of the key experiences that you think kind of shaped them as revolutionaries, as theorists, and so on?
Okay, I will try my best. I'm not a historian, so please forgive me if I mess anything up. But Ching is a very interesting character. He gets a lot of flack because he was one of the leading figures that was involved in what would later become the land reforms that happened in Vietnam. And the land reforms are still considered not wrong, but perhaps mishandled, done in the wrong situation. But I think that can be put aside, and he should be acknowledged for his role as a cultural theorist. Um, just as a bit of background about him. Obviously, his name Chung Ching is not his real name. Chung Ching actually means long march, which is what inspired by Mao and the long march. That's what his name is. His real name, I think, was Dang Xuan Vien. Dang Xuan Vien. Maybe I'm butchering. Dang Xuan Vien. And he was born in the north, just southeast of Hanoi, near the Delta. Not a rich family, but fairly respected because they were an intellectual family. So his grandfather was a intellectual for the Nguyen court. Yeah, he worked for the Nguyen court under the emperor, and he basically published like lots of texts on the history and Confucian literature and that kind of thing. And that carried on with his father as well, who was also a Confucian scholar. Father was quite interesting because he was a rebel in his own right. He joined what was later called the Tonkin Free School movement. It's mentioned in the book, a small revolutionary group basically, and he was imprisoned for that. So the politics were there from the start, but also this interest, in literature, in art, in history, and that kind of thing, in the liberal arts basically. Um, and because of this, from his father and grandfather, he learned classical Chinese, which was the lingua franca basically at the time for writing. He also attended the first French school, the first school, the first French school for Vietnamese that was set up. He attended, but he obviously was overly influenced by the French revolutionaries, and he was involved in an anti-colonial student movement, which got him expelled. Um, and where he then just moved to a university in Hanoi. Um, After that, I believe he worked at a publishing house, which interestingly is what Nguyen Phu Trong did as well. Um, and then through the publishing house, he became a member of the Central Propaganda Committee in the 30s. And it was during this time where he attempted to meet with a member of the French Communist Party, and he was caught. He was arrested by the French Secret Service, and tortured. He was imprisoned at Harlow Prison, which is the prison that became the Hanoi Hilton. That's where he was. He was transferred to another prison, but ultimately released in, I think, 1936. But during his jail time, he wrote extensively. He wrote poetry and polemics and basically just information. on Marxist-Leninism. He even started these prison-based communist movements. I think history has shown us, don't imprison communists. If you ever want them to write, don't put them in jail. Don't give them that much free time. And because of this, because of his prison-based communist movement that he established, he became quite popular. And his inner party popularity, obviously after he was released, grew quite significantly because he conducted a lot of clandestine operations during the World War II period. And then, yeah, he, in the late 30s, the colonial government, the French, really started cracking down and arresting and assassinating figures. And during this time, he basically served as general secretary of the party for this period. And then in 1941, he was officially elected as the Secretary General and the head of Department of Propaganda and Training, I think it was called. I suppose it let me like try and break down the whole events that led to this book and these figures. At the end of World War II, or towards the concluding stages of it, the relationship between France and Japan, which were the dual occupiers of Vietnam at the time, started breaking down, and with both sides vying for control of the country. And basically, they attempted to control Vietnam's cultural identity in this pursuit for, regional dominance. And because of this, it was Ho Chi Minh that recognized the need for some sort of cultural revolution, to basically regain control of whatever Vietnamese culture was at that time. So a secret meeting was convened. I can't remember the days. I think at end of February 1943, but in February 1943, they met somewhere in Hanoi, and they basically established the groundwork for what would become what was called the National Salvation Cultural Association, which was basically the cultural front of the Viet Minh. And they basically sought to, assemble Vietnam's intellectuals and artists under this party leadership. At this meeting is where Chinh wrote the outline. So the outline is one of the first documents in the text. It's what I imagine to be minutes of the meeting, because as you can see, it's very point form. And that was to be the guiding document for Vietnamese culture. In 1948, they held what was called the National Cultural Assembly. And it was there, and obviously this was attended by political leaders and fighters, but also writers and poets and painters, and sculptors, whatever. And it was there that Chinh delivered Marxism and Vietnamese culture, which is probably the main text in the book. And what that was a much more refined and theoretically systematized development of the outline. So basically, where the original outline just said, we need socialist realism. These are the problems. The answer is socialist realism. Marxism and Vietnamese culture, like it drew on all the historical conditions of the time. It was very methodical, and it basically argued how these things need to be laid out, what this means. What is socialist realism in this context? So it was a much more refined version of the document. And that document was to serve as the cultural foundation. And it was basically implemented as a decree. And I'm sure, as every creative person knows, an artist hates nothing more than being told what to do, decree or not. Irrespective of your politics, every artist does not want to be told what to do. So it sent a lot of ripples through the creative community, but also a lot of confusion, because there were a lot of artists that wanted to contribute to this cause and work in the struggle, but did not really know how to implement their skills. They knew what they had to do, but they didn't really know how to do it. And that's kind of where Tohu came in. In 1949, the party organized what was called the Debate on Art and Literature. It was like a 4-day conference in Witbach, which was the headquarters basically at that time. And that sought to clarify, the role and obligation of the artist. And this was done through discussions and criticisms. And it's really where Tohu basically, who at that time was a poet, he was known as the great socialist realist poet. It was at that time that he really basically cemented his leadership role in the arts. I mean, he's an interesting character as well. So he started writing poetry as a kid, and he joined the party, I think, at 19. But like terrible luck, I think we're within a few weeks after joining the party, he was arrested, and tortured and imprisoned by the French authorities. But he managed to escape, I think, in 1942, and basically rejoined the party, where he started working his way up through the propaganda and training department, as well as the art and literature department. And then in 1948, I believe, he became Deputy Secretary General of the Vietnam Arts and Culture Association.
Much appreciated. Thank you for the background. So there's another thing that you deal with in the introduction, which is obviously, these thinkers are um, not thinking about these things totally independent and isolated, right? Like there's the influence of prior thinking and theory around socialist realism, around socialism and communism in art and in revolutionary movements. And I found that section of the introduction where you kind of talk about that really interesting, because one of the factors here, there's a couple. I mean, there's the relationship between Vietnam and China, which is complicated to say the least. And then there's obviously the Sino-Soviet split, which happens not until 1960. So a lot of this book is written is documents that were prior to that, and a good portion of it is also documents that happen afterwards. But obviously, that had a lot of ramifications, not just on Vietnam, but on the communist movement and all around the world. But part of what you're also looking at is how these Vietnamese artists and theorists, right, crafted their own theory and practice of revolutionary art in the Vietnamese context, and the thinking that they put forward, and to this overall body. So maybe you could say a little bit about that context.
So yeah, the Sino-Soviet split was a big deal for most socialist countries, but especially Vietnam with its regional positioning. Um, at the time when most of these texts were written, so yes, China and Vietnam have a very difficult relationship. But when most of these texts were written, um, China was actually the largest benefactor, or I think benefactor is the correct word, benefactor the of Vietnam at the time, and especially the struggle. So Stalin tended to keep the Viet Minh at arm's length. The reason being, I believe, to win support from the West, he needed allies in the West, and obviously with France being the colonial power, it was this. I mean, if we want to turn it to back to the arts a little bit, um, this was around the time when the Soviets organized the International Congress for the Defense of Culture. I think it was called in France, in Paris, um, where and basically where Soviet socialist realism kind of got going. Um, I think well, what we can all recognize looking at I'm sure we'll get more into it later. But when we look at Soviet socialist realism, the one thing we recognize is that it's very reminiscent of classical art, of that European classical kind of thing. And this was basically the Soviet Union trying to position itself as the defender, I guess, of this European humanist tradition, which was then like rendered tangible through classical art, um, against fascist barbarism, which was the emerging threat, the greater threat that it needed to win support against. And for this reason, the relationship between the Soviet Union and Vietnam was there, and it was a good one, but it was really kept a lot more at arm's length than it could have potentially been. But at the same time, Vietnam has always done really well in practicing um, what I think, if I'm not mistaken, what General Secretary Nguyen Phu Trong called bamboo diplomacy. Where you like a bamboo tree move between sides depending on the situation, on the context. And Vietnam always did a very good job of positioning itself between China and the Soviet Union. Interestingly, it was Chinh who was believed to have led, the Maoist faction, and alongside Ho Chi Minh, who led the Soviet faction. And then it would work like that. Yeah, with the Sino-Soviet split, Vietnam essentially chose Moscow in the end. At the time, so the thing is that Stalin, and even to an extent Khrushchev, really did keep Vietnam at arm's length, but under Kosygin, um, the relationship really improved, and he actually became the biggest benefactor for Vietnam at that point. But it's not surprising that Vietnam basically sided itself with the Soviet Union. As you say, the relationship with China is a difficult one. And it's quite funny. What I, what I should state is that the the joke, it's sometimes joked about as the 2,000-year beef, because that's how long this beef has been going on for. The irony is that since the establishment of the communist parties in both countries, this is probably the best that the relationship has ever been. So when we look at it, we're quick to assume that this is a bad relationship. This relationship is significantly better now than what it's been over the course of the last 2,000 years. But because of that, because of this history of conquest and invasion and all sorts of things, Vietnamese traditionally had a mistrust towards China, and I think that this helped inform this choice between the Sino-Soviet divorce, whether you're going with mom or dad. This kind of informed it a little bit, maybe on a subconscious level. But yes, that essentially soured relations with Mao, and from that point, I mean, people, there's always diplomacy. Everyone has to always be tactful, but relations deteriorated a little bit during that time, and that's perhaps where it got to its worst, when it culminated in the 1979 invasion. And what that 1979 invasion did, and what the relevance of why I'm saying all this, despite the fact I live in Vietnam and China, is that after that, there was a lot of hostility and negativity towards China. And texts, especially ones like from Chinh, who himself was inspired by a lot of these Chinese thinkers, were basically corrected, where they went back and they scrubbed a lot of the pro-Chinese sentiment and what was perceived to be Chinese ideology out of it. The text in this book, 3, 4, 5 of them fell victim to that. You can see in some of the footnotes where I say, that the sentence was actually removed at this point, and this paragraph was removed. But the thing is that despite removing these elements, a lot of the Vietnamese cultural policy at the time and influence, especially the aesthetic influence, was inspired more by the Chinese than by the Soviets. I mean, it's Vietnam's northern border. The language is similar at that point. It's unsurprising that that's how information would be disseminated. I mean, Ho Chi Minh's poetry, some of it was Chinese. It's the relationship was much closer on a people level with China than with the Soviets at the time. And I think that what happened is there was this need for Vietnam to now distance itself from China, despite being so connected, especially in the aesthetic cultural front. And what happened is a lot of aside from the text being, censored, for lack of a better word, there was this push to try and reinterpret them as being uniquely Vietnamese conceptions, as if they were entirely homegrown. And the problem with that is that these aesthetic conceptions, yes, they came from China, but the way that they were understood and implemented and evolved in Vietnam were completely unique. There was no need for that cutting. They had come over the border and evolved to meet the circumstances, completely different, oftentimes completely contrasting what where they originated from. But by cutting this severing this connection, it caused a lot of unnecessary confusion. I think that breaks it up. The main point, I think, just as an example, is Mao was not really very fond of the whole negation of a negation thing, and basically he didn't really like that system, and that was a system that was fairly established in the Soviet Union at the time. He sought to basically try and reintroduce this tension between two opposing elements, and he basically drew a lot from Taoism in that regard. Think yin yang for like not really, but it's a good visualization. And this idea that where he saw the Hegelian synthesis of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, he saw that as two basically merging into one. He recognized it as some sort of like reconciliatory if that's the right word, reconciliatory love child of the two. You have this, and then negated by this, and it makes this. That interpretation, he basically turned around into this idea of one divides into two, where there is where all, how do I say this now? Let me try to think of a good example. Where basically there's a constant tension between two things. So the idea being that with a synthesis, with the Hegelian synthesis, if we can even call it that, the idea of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, what that does is it basically calls for the reestablishment of the old, because we haven't followed through to try and get the words here, because we haven't followed the system through to the end, right? We don't know what the final result is. So if we have this, and this is the negation, and then this is the synthesis of the two, our call for this synthesis is always a subconscious return to the original, because we've yet to comprehend the revolution through to its end. Basically, any true revolution must revolutionize its starting presuppositions, and the, if that makes sense, and this view of the Hegelian synthesis sort of betrays this. So that was the view that Ching and Tao Yu really tried to bring in to the Vietnamese side, and actually where it started really gaining its feet, where I think at least it was more successful in the Vietnamese context than in the Chinese context. I mean, if we look at something like the Cultural Revolution, basically, where there was this need to destroy basically all the cultural artifacts that could potentially reestablish capitalism. So there was this idea that the revolution needs to be a true revolution, it has to revolutionize its starting presuppositions. But this was not really successful in the Cultural Revolution, because it never went far enough, because there was never this embrace of the impossibility of such a task, really. That we hate capitalism, right? Millennials kill capitalism. Okay, cool. Let's say we somehow figure out a way to kill capitalism. We have come up with that conception from within the capitalist system. So as long as we're there, it is still there, despite the revolution being successful. And sorry, I tried to get to that in a very convoluted way, and trying to not get deep and into things. It's like 10 o'clock here. My brain is already tofu. But the Vietnamese really did acknowledge this almost sense of impossibility, of I want to call it failure, but not really failure, just an almost hopelessness, but a hopelessness that inverses itself for that very reason. There is a what was his name? An author. Nguyen Thang Viet. Nguyen Thang Viet, I think. I could be wrong. He wrote, I think he's American Vietnamese. He wrote a book called The Sympathizer that just made it into a TV show.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is what it is. But he at least has a very interesting thing in that book, where he takes a famous quote from Ho Chi Minh: "Nothing is more precious than independence and freedom." Probably the most famous quote. And while he uses it in an incorrect way with what he's trying to say, the way that he breaks apart the quote is very, I think, correct, where he puts the emphasis not on the independence and freedom part of the quote. So he's not saying, that nothing is more precious than independence and freedom. He's not saying that independence and freedom are the most important thing. He focuses on the nothing as being the crucial part. That nothingness itself is more important. Nothingness is more precious than independence and freedom. And in that regard, this idea that, like any desire, in there must be this understanding. One must be cognizant of the inability to ever truly fulfill that desire. And I think that was the secret weapon, basically, that the Vietnamese had on some level, on some conscious level, that transcended into the art.
Yeah.
If any of that makes sense.
No, that makes sense, and I think a good way for us to bridge that maybe a little bit into the current context. We were talking a little bit before we started about the interest of having this conversation right now. And obviously, um, Palestine is on everybody's mind due to the genocide, but also due to the heroic resistance of Palestinians and members of the Axis resistance, people that are really struggling against U.S. imperialism and Zionist settler colonialism. And obviously, it reading the book, one of the things I mentioned to you before we started too. One of the things that's fascinating to me was how much the term resistance came up. And I was sort of looking at that and thinking, that's interesting because obviously it's something that we're hearing a lot right now. It's a term that has regained a kind of revolutionary character after it was destroyed by liberals during the Trump era. But the the point that was interesting is I was sort of like thinking, I'm wondering what the translation is and if this is actually, the term, because obviously, in other contexts you might say liberation struggle, or you might say, revolution or things like this. But then I was also thinking about, as you're talking about it, then I was like, I looked up what did the Vietnamese actually call what we call in the United States the Vietnam War, right? And of course, they call it the American War, but there's also this longer kind of version of the war of resistance against America, or something along those lines, and a recognition of resisting colonialism, right? Which is certainly fundamental to a lot of the texts that you're looking at. Um, and again, like as you said, like there might be a way of reading that, um and perhaps we can kind of even move into a little bit of conversation around Ho Chi Minh and revolutionary theory broadly within Vietnam here. But you could read that as just a negation, right? Of just, we want these forces removed. We want colonialism to be gone. We want to get rid of this thing, this imposition, similar to millennials are killing capitalism, for sure, of like we name this thing that we are against, and we're struggling against this thing that we are against. But in that, if we win that struggle against the thing that we are against, how do we actually revolutionize into what we are for? What is the new society? What is the new man, right? That they often, revolutionary kind of theory often grapples with, right? Of how does resistance, how does revolution produce a new kind of human if we know how dehumanizing these systems that we're rebelling against is. And so you talk about that, you've alluded to it there. And um, this is also something, again, where like Ho Chi Minh is often discussed as, again, like a nationalist, an anti-colonial thinker, right? But you're proposing too that there's something embedded in this theory, I think, that there's an unsatisfied kind of drive within it that, if I understand you correctly, you're saying it continues to hold a revolutionary character, because it's not just looking to sort of move beyond the current order and then to be like, "Hey, we won." So yeah, go ahead, respond if you would like to what I just said.
I don't know if you know the joke, but the reason why we have to call it the Vietnam War rather than the American War is that if we called it the American War, we would not know which one we're talking about.
Right.
But no, I think the Palestinian thing is a good example of what I'm trying to say, where we have this, if we follow this basic Hegelian idea of the dialectic, where we have, okay, we have Palestine, and then we have this other force, Israel, and so we meet in the middle. We have two-state solution, right? That two-state solution is ultimately a callback to the previous one. For a revolution to be truly successful, it has to be total, and we cannot comprehend what a total revolution is. That is the main thing. It is we have to basically come to terms with that fact that we don't know what the final outcome is. Africa, as another example, you know how it was divided up by colonial powers, and then they left. They said, "Cool, you're now independent, but you're independent in regards to the borders that we have left you with." It's not an outcome. It is just a return to, you know, the previous. That's why that twist on the Ho Chi Minh quote I like so much. It's this notion that, you know, nothing is more important than freedom and independence. Because in order to have freedom, in order to have independence, we must have unfreedom as well. And if unfreedom exists, how can freedom exist? You know, at this moment, we are uncaged, but we can only know that we're uncaged because a cage exists. So until that cage doesn't exist, it being uncaged is not really a thing in itself. Um, yeah, the question of nationalism, with Ho Chi Minh, I think it's very much a semantic issue. Um, the so I think I mentioned it, but quite a when Ho Chi Minh has been attacked for being nationalist rather than communist, and I mean it's quite weird. The only people who have ever had this argument with me, putting arguing that Ho Chi Minh is more a nationalist than a communist, have been Western leftists. It's bizarre. You know, ask any rightist, I guess you call them. Ask any rightist, what's Ho Chi Minh? They'll say he's a commie. Yeah, yeah. But I think it's got to do with our conceptualization of nationalism and that. And I mean, okay, in that sense, Ho Chi Minh did have a lot of nationalist tendencies, you know, and some structurally reformist things. And so maybe he was not primarily a Marxist, but in that sense, he was not a Marxist in almost the exact same way that Marx, um, when he was criticizing, who was it, Gad and Lafargue, I think, said, you know, I'm not a Marxist. So yeah, he's not a Marxist, but in the same way that Marx said he wasn't a Marxist, where he went against this opting of revolutionary phrase-mongering over any tangible achievements for the workers through, albeit reformist tactics. And yeah, so the one thing is there's a word you will see what I translate as Vietnamization, and this is probably the one of the most important things in the book, and something that I think is open to a lot of criticism for, which would be interesting. I really hope someone takes it further and talks about this. But the word, what is it called? Zantakoa. Zantakoa. Sorry, my pronunciation is terrible. Um, is the Vietnamese term, and that's what I translate as Vietnamization. Now, normally it's translated as nationalism, but it can also mean a range of things. It can mean the term can mean nation, it can mean ethnicity, it can mean race. It's got a whole bunch of these meanings that it can mean when translated. And I was really inspired by Wallerstein. Actually, I can just pull it up quick. By Wallerstein in this regard, where when I was trying to translate this term, because he quite succinctly puts forward that if we look at these terms, in isolation, race, nation, ethnicity, he says that race stems from the axial division of labor, wherein capital accumulates by creating unequal differentiations of human value. Nation stems from the political superstructure of this historical system, where capital accumulates by creating unequal differentiations of sovereignty. And then ethnicity stems from the creation of household structures, where capital accumulates through the maintenance of components of non-wage labor. So basically, these three terms, race, nation, ethnicity, are already embedded in the capitalist world economy. And trying to translate this Vietnamese term would ultimately embed it in the capitalist world economy, where it previously is not embedded in that. So rather than leaving it untranslated, we chose to go with Vietnamization, but Vietnamization lowercase, because it's not actually Vietnam is the content. Then it would be Vietnam one, but it can be anything. It can be Vietnamization, South Africanization, Americanization, depending on the context. It basically is if we say the Vietnamese-ness of something, it's that ness. It's the essence of it, and it's quite interesting how it went about in finding this essence. There's a lot in the book, or Vietnamese scholars at the time, talking about it and what it means to be Vietnamese, and this especially because at the time, when this quest for Vietnamese-ness was happening, the Viet Minh were purging a lot of what constituted Vietnamese heritage. So this idea of what makes something Vietnamese was not a result of someone saying this is Vietnamese, but it was designated by the negating of that which it wasn't, basically. So if we want to say, what is American, we can't say this is American or this is American. What we have to say is that, okay, this is not American. This is not American. This is not American. And that's how we trim, the fat to discover this essence. And I think, yeah, you can kind of see the connections back to that Mao's conception of, two dividing into one. Sorry, other way around. One dividing into two.
Right on. Sorry, I was pulling up this just to show an example again from the art from the book. Thank you for that. Um, I want to move actually ahead into a couple of the pieces just so we could talk a little bit about some of the thinking that these figures are doing in the book. So there's this great essay in the collection. It's a longer one. There's some of these that are very short pieces, like you said. Some of them are kind of like minutes from meetings, or like sets of some of them are, like you said, kind of bulleted or itemed out
Yeah,
as like these are, which makes sense. It's like sort of it's like principles of unity or things like that that people might be familiar with. But there's this great essay that's called Marxism and Vietnamese Culture, that's written by Chinh in 1948. So in this essay, he lays out some history of the development of Vietnamese culture, the various colonial and external influences upon it, how to relate to positive and negative aspects of the culture, which again, like the way that he talks about that reminds me a lot of Amilcar Cabral's writing around culture. Um, and in this period, there are these efforts, these early efforts to establish a united cultural front and towards the development of art cadres in connection with the masses and the military's resistance to colonialism. So, can you talk a little bit about this stage and the cultural front and the resistance, and how Trong Chin saw the role of artists in supporting resistance at this time?
I like the fact that you mentioned Cabral, because there are a lot of similarities there. Um, I think his main work on this idea of a cultural front and even Africanization um, came from, I could be wrong, but came from a debate with Frelimo, I think at the time. Frelimo were the Mozambicans. And it's quite interesting that we can make that link, because I think that the Mozambican attempt at socialist realism is very, very reminiscent of the Vietnamese, whether conscious or not, and probably not. It there was a very similar trajectory that was followed. Um, so basically, um, what happened in Mozambique is, for their cultural front, they had, similar to Vietnam, basically like collectives, sometimes villages, but usually like communal collectives that would create crafts or focus on producing one product. Um, and there is a ethnic group in the north of Mozambique called the Makonda, who make really, really amazing wooden sculptures out of a material called blackwood, really strong wood. And these collectives had basically been formed originally, making, like trinkets for tourists and colonizers and that kind of thing. Like that, these little wooden figurines of colonial subjects carrying this Portuguese man on I don't know what you call those things, but little 4 guys carrying him. And I mean, these little sculptures were horrible. The Mozambican figures looked emaciated, and compared to the little colonial figure who sat at the top, it was always made out of something nice, like ivory, white, something white essentially, and then they were made out of this black wood. And what happened is that with the the Samora Machel's push to create a cultural front in Mozambique, they approached these collectives, and that became the socialist realist work. And what was interesting was that it kind of remained unchanged. So they kept producing these same artifacts in the same style, where it showed colonial subjects, carrying this colonial figure. A guy named Alex Bortolot, I think, has written a lot about this. But basically, these figures showed, these little artifacts showed the inhumanity of what was happening. And I think that that's quite interesting, because Ho Chi Minh, when he was in Paris, he worked for a newspaper called Le Pariah, I think Le Pariah, and he would occasionally draw cartoons. And one of his more famous cartoons is almost the exact same thing. This rickshaw guy carrying this French master, and the Vietnamese figure, pulling the rickshaw, is thin and weak, and compared to the the colonizer figure, who is portrayed quite positively. And I mean, it's interesting to compare this to the work that you see coming from, like, the Soviet Union and China. Where China had what was called revolutionary romanticism, where everything was very positive, and the Soviet Union as well. I mean, if you actually have to pull up Google and Google Soviet anti-colonial poster, you're bound to see how the colonial subjects are always depicted as being strong, as these strong, muscular figures, compared to the colonizers and the oppressors, who are these like grotesque little monsters. I think the most famous Soviet one is of a African guy with chains, and he's choking. He's basically like broken his chains, and he's choking out this little colonizer. And I mean, he's big and tough, looking like Muhammad Ali. And this little colonizer is a grotesque little thing, looking like some Batman villain. And this is quite interesting. This almost opposite way of doing things, where what you see in the Vietnamese and the Mozambicans is this almost this acknowledgement of weakness. And I mean, just over not over the border, over two borders, if you look at Namibia, where North Korea has helped build a lot of the aesthetic of modern Namibia in Windhoek. So in Windhoek, the capital of Namibia, there is in the town's, the city center, there's like an old colonial church on the one side, some colonial fort on the other side, and then this hill in the middle. And on the hill was a monument to the German soldiers that were lost or killed while committing the Herero and the Makwa genocide. Yeah, I don't know why they got a monument, but what Namibia did, rightfully, I guess, was throw this monument out, and almost severing this like colonial aesthetic vein in the city. They built a national museum, using very socialist realist, especially from the North Korean side, aesthetics. And everyone knows that this museum for the statue of Njoma in the front. But at the back of this museum is a monument to the victims of the Herero and the Makwa genocide. And it's almost identical to the Soviet posters, showing these victims strong and muscular, and breaking their chains. But the thing is that that's not the reality. Is that it was a genocide, and I mean that genocide was carried out basically almost entirely through starvation. So it's this misrepresentation. We can understand why, but at the same time, it does little to, to acknowledge that. I wouldn't call it a weakness, but to acknowledge that maybe weakness is the right word, is to acknowledge this weakness in oneself that you can see coming through in the Vietnamese resistance work. And I suppose in terms of Palestine at the moment is that if we look at the world right now, where is more hopeless than Gaza? And I think that there's power in that. That's where the real aesthetic power lies, is in that hopelessness. Just because something is hopeless, it doesn't mean that it's a failure. In fact, it means the complete opposite, essentially. And I think that aesthetic consideration is a lot stronger, a lot more successful than the one of misrepresenting, if that makes sense.
Much appreciated. And apologies, folks, if I look like I was partly distracted. I am trying to console one of my little ones. Um, let's see. So let's talk about some of the other phrases, right? So you talk about Vietnamization already. You said a little bit about that. There's also a phrase that comes up several times: revolutionizing of ideology and massification of activity. So you could talk a little bit about what those concepts mean.
Yeah, so that's definitely tell you. Um, so I think when reading that statement, revolutionizing of thought and massification of activity, I think it's important not to read it as like a either or kind of thing. Like it's they need to be linked together. You can't have the revolutionizing of thought without the massification of identity. I mean, sorry, activity. Um, what what is meant by that? Um, Obviously, we understand that this concept of revolutionizing thought, where it's not just about achieving our dreams. For a revolution to be a revolution in totality, we have to change those dreams themselves. And but we seem, and this is something particularly relevant, I guess, in the Western sense, at least from what I've seen, is there's this notion that something revolutionary is almost automatically leftist. If that makes sense. Is we have this idea that the revolution is always a leftist phenomenon, which is obviously not the case. I mean, in terms of revolutions and successfulness, I guess one of the most successful revolutions was the fascist one, was the Nazis, how they came to power. Just because something is revolutionary doesn't make it good, you know. I mean, I'm probably going to get a lot of flack, but I think capitalism is the most revolutionary system. I mean, it's a suicidal system. It needs to constantly revolutionize itself to stay alive. There's nothing revolutionizing itself as fast as capitalism. I mean, you guys now have the possibility of having your first black female president. That's revolutionary. That's revolutionary. The problem comes in is that a revolution without the masses is worthless. And I think a lot of people get sucked into this revolution first without this need for the masses, for embedding oneself within the masses. And I think that's what the massification of activity means. Tohu was very a big proponent on this idea of being not just working for the masses, but of being really embedded with them, and creating this interconnected voice of the masses. And that needs to be the guiding voice for the revolution. So it's an interesting phrase, but yeah, I think it needs to be taken as a whole, not like an and or kind of thing.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's the point you made about revolution. I appreciate. We did this conversation with yeah. Hang on. It was a couple years ago, and it was on this book, which it's now on Haymarket. Actually, it's by Robbie McVeigh and Bill Rolston, and it's titled Ireland, Colonialism, and the Unfinished Revolution. And one of the things that they talk about in this book is like the influence of the Irish on all kinds of different figures, and they talk about Menachem Begin, who is, for folks who don't know, a Zionist, settler. But the interesting part, and it was something that actually a Palestinian reached out to me about, understandably quite frustrated with, right, was that they refer to all of these figures as revolutionary. And, I had that exact conversation of they're not actually using revolution in the way that we often use it, as this inherently progressive or left meaning thing. They're saying, because they also use figures like Thomas Jefferson, they use all kinds of people, and what they were saying was that that uh, that independent struggle of the Irish was profoundly influential upon all types of revolutionary movements, good and bad, right? And and we might similarly think about the American Revolution in this context, which was tremendously influential around the world to a lot of people. Ho Chi Minh, for one, at one point cited the importance of the American Revolution to his thinking, right? And yet we can say, this is not actually. Yeah, there's a lot of debate. I don't want to get into the debate on the left about the American Revolution, right? But just to say that obviously it was certainly not revolutionary for everybody, right? And certainly not for indigenous people or enslaved folks, and not revolutionary for, you know, the billions of people that the United States would go to war with over the subsequent years. And so, yeah, I mean, well, millions probably, but anyway, hundreds of millions. So I appreciate that point. Another one that you talk about, or not that you, but the theorists are talking about, is scientification. Like I think the key principles were Vietnamization, scientification, and massification, which we've talked about a couple of those already. But say a little bit about how they're articulating and thinking about scientification, because I think also this is something that for artists, I mean, I think people have ambivalence about science in general because of what Western science has often kind of meant, and it can lead to sort of particularly mechanical readings of Marxism and things like that too. Um, but how did they think about this idea of scientification?
I think the conception of scientification is quite fun, in the sense that it it basically considers science as that which is provable, which I suppose it is, really. If that is science. And what this idea of scientification meant was that it was basically an attempt to stop the emergence of fantasy coming through. That's a bit difficult. What is meant by that is one of the key differences, I suppose, between fascist art and socialist art, and fascism and socialism in general, is that fascism relies on fantasy. In the sense, it relies on this repressed element in us that isn't real. And I mean, this repressed element in us is something that we all have, which is why, unfortunately, we all have the ability to be to drift into fascism, and it's why it happens, because fantasy is a part of our reality. When so I think Daniel Dennett writes a lot about this, but with our like conception of reality, it's not a straightforward stream. Effectively, there's gaps. Our brain is not a supercomputer. It can't just stream like this. It has to just log key things and then fill in the gaps in between. And the gaps, the way that the gaps are filled is ultimately through fantasy. So fantasy is something that's in us all, but there's also this element of repressed fantasy. I think Chinh calls it the monstrosities of fantasy, and that's the kind of stuff that gives rise to fascism. There's this conceptualization of the Jew, for example, this mystical, ridiculous thing that is obviously so unrealistic, but still holds so much power. And I mean, we can draw similarities here between religion and all sorts of things. But this mystical, well, not mystical, this repressed fantasy in us all is really the source of fascism. It's the driving force behind fascism. So what scientification sought to do was to try and limit the emergence of this fantasy coming through. And that's obviously something quite difficult. The way that this was done was based off of Engels, a suggestion actually made by Engels in a letter, that work needs to focus more on typical situations. And essentially what is meant by typical situations is stuff that is true, realistic, things that can possibly happen. I mean, yeah, it's very complicated, and I know we don't have a lot of time, especially on my side as we approach midnight. But the essentially that's what it comes down to, is scientification was almost like an attempt to stop the emergence of this repressed fantasy coming through, because this repressed fantasy would ultimately lead to fascism. And I mean, this is where the whole conflict, I guess, the antagonism between modernist abstract art and socialist realism comes into play, where the one basically grounds itself in the content of the art, and the other grounds itself in the form of the art. And what that does is, by grounding oneself in the form, it allows the repressed fantasies to emerge. I know I shouldn't bring Freud into it, but he's got a really like wonderful thing in, I can't remember, in the book about dreams. Basically, he has this patient study where this guy's talking to him about this dream that he has of being a kid at a hotel, and he goes into the wrong room, a room that's not his, and he opens the door, and there, I think that there's two women, a mother and a daughter, that are changing their clothes. They're naked, and this kid sees two naked women for the first time, and then the dad marches in, and suddenly there's a gap. He can't remember, and he's trying to figure out, what happened, what was this missing gap, what happened to me in this space that I can't remember. And Freud interprets this as the gap being essentially the lack of the phallus in the woman that he saw. That is the content re-emerged as the form. So the dream is the form, and the content is him seeing women naked for the first time, him seeing women without a phallus, with no penis, him seeing the gap for the first time. And that content has re-emerged as the form itself, as the dream. And that happens with art, where we rely on form, the repressed content sneaks in. You can't repress content. That is the thing. It will always come out. And if it doesn't come out in the content, it will come out in the form. And I think that is essentially what this principle of scientification sought to stop.
Mm-hmm. Appreciated. So I know it is getting late there, and I don't want to keep you too much longer so that you can get some rest. But maybe one of the things that we could talk about a little bit is that obviously this book takes place over, it's a series of writings across multiple decades, right? And so what are ways that you see the movement and these cultural theorists and the folks that they're debating with and dialogue with, criticizing, self-criticizing, right? How does this evolve? Like, as you read the book through, as you read the text through, what are some of the things that you see changing? Obviously, the struggle itself changes, right? So from the 40s into the mid 70s, right? The war takes different there's different aspects of it. There's different forces being resisted. There's obviously the North becomes liberated, and then the South. There's the battle with this proxy, in the South and the United States. And so, anyways, how do you see this? This artistic struggle kind of deepening, and what are some of the interesting maybe debates within it or aspects within it that you see developing over the course of it?
You mentioned the criticism and the role of self-criticism. I think it's important just to draw a little bit on that, if you don't mind. It's one of a good example where, like I was saying earlier, where although originally drawing from what was happening in China, the Vietnamese circumstances created a whole new thing, a unique thing. And I think that's visualized quite nicely in the role of criticism and self-criticism, and how it was established there. So that element of criticism came from, essentially it came from Mao, from Mao's talks at Yan'an, where was kind of the first guiding principles of what a cultural front, I guess, in China would ascertain. But and just while you bring up these pictures, important to note, like we've been talking about, this concept of understanding that the revolution can never fully satisfy itself. You can see how the artists grappled with this conception in their art, in the form itself, the incompleteness of the drawing. Compare this artwork to, the revolutionary romanticism of China at the time, or the Soviet fine art portraits. You can kind of see how these artists were grappling with this concept of embracing the gap, of embracing this gap. Anyway, but to go back to the criticism thing. So Mao's talks were basically, what was happening at the time were Chinese artists were becoming quite despondent. The struggle was not doing too well, and they were growing quite dispirited. And basically, Mao's talks were almost like a discipline, really. At that time, the artists, the role of the artist had been to educate the masses. And what the talks did was they shifted this role where the artists now had to become students of the masses. They were to go out, embed themselves with the masses, and become students. So they went from teachers to students. And it was very much like a demotion, a disciplinary demotion for the artists who at that time had grown dispirited and were becoming a little bit, I don't know what the word is, against what was going on. But what happened in the Vietnamese context was that these struggle sessions, as the Chinese call them, these criticism sessions, became a way for the masses to educate themselves through the vehicle of the art and the artwork. So the artwork essentially showed them. It operated as a mirror to the masses, which the masses were then able to criticize. And in criticizing these artworks, they were essentially criticizing themselves. And what I mean by that is criticizing, the backwards elements of society at the time, criticizing the shortcomings and where things could be improved. So in that regard, it was really these criticism sessions were really successful, where they basically operated not just as a way for the artists to this idea of this stupid exercise where the artists go and let the peasants give their opinions of the work and then go back and change it. Artists are artists. No one cares about anyone else's opinions. But what they did was it basically created a mirror, because the artists depicted reality. They depicted the peasants, the masses, the workers, everyone as they were. And they held this mirror up to them, which the masses could then criticize, but in doing so, criticize themselves. And again, the self-criticism is super important. And as like all the previous stuff I've been saying, you can see how it's coming, it comes through back and back and back. And yeah, what was the second half of your question? I've already gone blank. Oh, you muted. Or either that or I'm deaf.
No, I'm muted. Thank you.
Okay.
The cardinal sin. Um, just kind of a discussion of how things evolved over time, right? So you talked about their criticism, self-criticism, but usually, I guess, to counterpose, right, to talk about Soviet socialist art, right? Like there's the period of like socialist realism, and then like there's like debates or interest in avant-garde, and like you get into glasnost and perestroika. Like there's different forms of art that kind of become prominent in different eras, because the socialist cultural theorists sort of propose that, hey, we're in this phase, this is what we need, right? And so I'm interested in some ways of if you see or how you see that kind of developing in in the context of the pieces that you're talking about in the art that they're discussing in the period.
It's an interesting question, because compared to other art movements and things, the evolution of these artworks um, was didn't change as much as you would expect. As things moved into the 60s and basically the war with America, um, there the focus on the cultural front was there, but this was very different to the war of independence, the war against the French. The war against the French was one fighting for independence. Um, and it was horrific, but it was never as chaotic and destructive as the American War. The American War was unlike anything that had ever taken place at that time. I mean, if you think about the bombing campaigns of Lao, it was something so beyond conception that there was a cultural front, but things had to be a lot more utilitarian at this point, war communism, for lack of a better word, in order to survive. So while artists still practice, there's a wonderful quote where Mao met with Ho Chi Minh um, during this point when the Cultural Revolution was starting, and Mao suggested to Ho Chi Minh that Vietnam should, carry out a cultural revolution, and Ho Chi Minh said that it's impossible. We're too busy trying to carry out a military revolution, and I think that succinctly captures what was happening at that time, where the military revolution was the one, and things took on a lot more utilitarian dimension. This is obviously the time where the propaganda poster, as we know it now, became more prevalent because this kind of information needed to be quickly disseminated. Um, you can see in the texts towards the end how originally Chongqing um, is a bit annoyed by the the unfinishedness of the Vietnamese works. This embracing of the gap, how it actually annoys him a little bit. But then as time progresses, you can see how that's the Chinese one, just for comparison. Um, you can see how with To Hu, um, it changes and he becomes less focused. He says technique doesn't matter, essentially. The I think he has a quote that the masses are starving, that they don't need fancy dishes at this point. They just get what you can out there, and things took on a lot more of a utilitarian role. But that doesn't take away from the artworks itself. And you can see how incredible the pieces are in their own right.
Absolutely. And as you're talking about that, that's one of the things too that we didn't you probably touched on it in part when I was partially distracted by my son, but the uh one of the things that I appreciated too is that there's like there's no, which you would somewhat expect that well, let me just say a couple things. So one, we think in the West of the artist often as being this kind of removed, isolated, working in isolation, individual practice, reflecting upon society, and we had a good conversation last week. Musa Springer was part of it, who also put out a book of poetry on Iskra Books that people can check out, Alive and Paranoid. Um, but Musa said, that very much encourage people not in the context of the West to be artists in isolation, right? To form collectives, to do it with people that you have political commitments with, right? To practice together, and I appreciated that call. And one of the things that you see in these pieces is like part of what they're talking about is like people, it's there's different levels. Like the the theorists are conscious that there's going to be artists that embrace the struggle, that come from different backgrounds, that um may adhere more to what their suggestions are around how what the form art should take, and some who may not, right? Because some people may not be as ideologically committed to this kind of Marxist Leninist view that they're talking about around certain things. But the that aside, like they're also talking about people participating in the war, right? They're talking about like, you know, literally soldiers who are also going to be,
Mm.
creating art as they're doing this,
Yeah.
right? And so that's one of the things too, and, I think Erica in that conversation, Erica Kanes last week also talked about it in the Cuban context of, when they talk to people, within Cuban context, it's like in the time of struggle, like the role of the artist is actually to pick up the gun, right? And like, so there's a little bit of that uh that discussion that's going on, and certainly a reality that some of this work is being produced by
Mm.
fighters, and that gives it a certain character, and some of it will be produced by other people, but it's like this overall view too of a kind of united cultural front, and trying to encourage people to create work that supports the resistance in a variety of ways. I don't know if that makes sense, but it was something that stood out to me in reading through some of the pieces.
Um, yeah, the notion of the soldier artist. I mean, yeah, that all the artists that in this book were fighting. They were all on various fronts. Um, I think the other thing to remember as well, in the not so much in the American War, but a little bit, but also with the particularly the war for independence against the French, was that these soldier artists also had to serve essentially as journalists, I guess, as recording the situation at the time, where these connections wouldn't have happened. And I mean, the Vietnamese conflicts have always been extremely separated. Um, what I mean by that is that fighting populations were really in decent contact with each other. I think, like, I mean, I'm sure you know about, the hamlets in the South, and how people had to, women especially, had to sneak in notes hidden in their hair, and how soldiers would check their hair to see that they weren't hiding notes. And communication was not all that easy, especially communication of victories and even losses that were happening. So these soldiers had to also, these artist soldiers had to also not only serve as artists to encourage the people and motivate, but also record the situation and the things that were happening at the time.
That's awesome. Um, I think, I do want to let you kind of wrap up. So maybe to close, one of the things that I kind of wanted to bring up is, what would you say, as you say, you're back and forth between China and Vietnam now in your work, which is why it's so late where you are right now. And uh, what do you see as the legacy of this within Vietnam? Like, how is it remembered there? How do you see the influence of the forms and styles of art that were developed during these various, resistance movements, revolutionary movements, today, and how have things maybe changed over time?
I think that so Vietnam is interesting in the sense that socialist realism is one of the few countries in the world where socialist realism doesn't really exist outside the circuit of art still, of public art. It's still produced, it still exists, um, it's still part of curriculums, that kind of thing. But I think the change that is happening is that socialist realism was never really a style. And I think this is a mistake that a lot of people make. They say, oh, this looks cool. This looks so socialist realist. That doesn't really mean anything. There's no style socialist realism. If you look at some of these Vietnamese works compared to some of the Soviet ones, compared to the Mozambique arts and crafts, they there's no like similarities. The thing that they share in common is that they exist as a frame of reference, basically. And that is where the socialist realism comes in, is how you read it, how you read it. To go back to the Mozambican, the Makonda Blackwood crafts, or even Ho Chi Minh's cartoon of this skinny Vietnamese colonial subject pulling this rich, fancy French colonial master on a little rickshaw. Now, that this work of a master having power over his slave is can be equally appreciated by the colonizer and the colonial subject. It depends on the reading of it. When if we look at that and we go, oh wow, it's so good that he's got power over this little man. Fuck you, you're a fascist. If we look at it and we have our sympathies for the oppressed, there we go. It's the reading that's important. And I think that reading is often underplayed when people like to draw connotations between fascist realism and socialist realism, because a lot of the later like Nazi art, it's got that whole strongman kind of vibe that Soviet socialist realism had as well, and American superhero comic books did. There's that, but it's not the form that's important. It's how one reads it. So it's a frame of reference that one exhibits, and I think that the form still exists in Vietnam. I still see it produced, even among students that I work with. I see that this form of socialist realism continuing, especially when it comes time to disseminate information. So for example, I previously worked with students designing COVID posters. I don't think there was a single non-socialist realist poster in that regard, because that's the norm for public communication is the socialist realist style. But I think that frame of reference is being lost, and it's becoming more of a style. This is something that you can see, perhaps. Obviously, I can't talk with any authority. In fact, I can't talk with any authority on anything. Let's just keep that in mind. But perhaps even more so here in Laos, where if you see Laos is another place where socialist realism is still popular, part of popular culture, basically. And you can see these really interesting monuments and things happening in Laos that are socialist realist in form. They look communist, but their content is source of us in Buddhist, predominantly Buddhist. And I think that's something that is starting to happen with Vietnam as it acknowledges the kitsch element of socialist realism, where it's losing that frame of reference of interpreting it as something that's socialist or not socialist, having this ideological interpretation rather than and seeing it basically just as a distinct style. If that does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. I mean, I think it's like it reminds me actually a little bit of like Joy James talking about simulacra in like where um we can wear t-shirts, right? I mean, like the Che Guevara t-shirt is probably like the quintessential example of this, right?
Yeah.
But it's like, it becomes um commodified, and it has, like you say, a certain kitsch kind of element to it, but it's not actually at this point a point of reference. It's something from the past. It's something that we can yeah, I don't know exactly. I'm not going to be able to get quite to the point of it, but essentially um the it
Don't
doesn't
worry,
hold the
I
same.
haven't been getting to any point I've been trying to make.
No, 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 you've been great. It doesn't get to these things, like you said, they were produced in a revolutionary context, right? And so the people who are reading them, viewing them, are relating to them in that way. And when you get outside of the kind of more active protagonistic, periods of this, um, yeah, we can have nostalgia about it. We can have a certain way of looking at it, relating to it, appreciating it. But we ourselves are, not
Mm.
um, not in that kind of protagonistic place. And I don't want to speak to again, like you said, I certainly don't want to speak authoritatively at all about Vietnam because I'm not in any way. But I understand that in sort of my own context of thinking about the revolutionary movements of the 60s and 70s, and obviously I have a great deal of appreciation for those in the US. But I also have to recognize that we're in a very different context right now, and we have to create things that relate to this context and resonate in a certain way, and it's that resonance that is important. So yeah, I don't know if that makes any sense. Um
Stalin had a like a pretty good um, way of like putting it forward, where he said that works as part of, I think, the I don't know, but basically where he said that works should be um, national in form and socialist in content. Basically, you want to speak the language of the people, irrespective of what that form is. If it's academic modern art, sorry, not modern, academic classical art in the Soviet Union, then so be it. If it's sculpted crafts in Mozambique, that's the language. So it should be national in language and socialist in, sorry, nationalist in form, national in form, and socialist in content. And I think we're getting to an interesting space now where we have socialist in form, which isn't even really a thing, and then whatever else in content.
That's interesting. A good place to leave it. Rule, I really appreciate it. Appreciate all of your time today. I encourage people to. I don't think the book's quite up for pre-order yet, but it should be soon, I imagine.
Soon, sure. So there's
Yeah.
there's I mean, if it will be in the next few months, I guess. But if you go onto the website, there should be like a notification letter,
Yep.
basically, that you can just subscribe to. I
Yep.
subscribed the other day as well, and you can see like when each new thing will come
Yep.
up, and that's how you can keep track.
Yeah, exactly. You can join an email list basically for Iskra Books from their website where you'll get notifications for each new release. I recommend people do that because their work is beautiful, not just this particular book, which I do. I mean, I hope people saw some of the art as we had this conversation as well. But yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful. It will be a beautiful book in print. Obviously, I have a digital copy for this conversation. But they also have a lot of great work at Iskra, and shout out to them.
And I
Definitely.
promise I do a better job of contextualizing it in the book than I do now at midnight in 40-degree weather.
Don't sell yourself short. It was a great conversation. And yes, the introduction that you write is excellent. And so are all of these incisive, essays and pieces from the figures that you're anthologizing in the work as well. So shout out to you, shout out to all the translators that helped you out, and to Iskra for publishing this. And yeah, thank you for this conversation.
Thank you for having me.